Welcome to the Somm Demand Studio. David Roby here, joined by my lovely and beautiful friend, Gianpaolo Paderlini, also wine director of Acquarello in San Francisco, and an authority on champagne, in my opinion, and many's as well, as I think you might drink more champagne. Champagne rivals your Nebbiolo consumption.
Oh, it exceeds my Nebbiolo consumption.
It exceeds your Nebbiolo consumption.
Yeah.
So we like to say when his Nebbiolo vitals are low, we have to shoot him up with his, Nebbiolo Barolo injections and champagne. I guess you're always just running.
It's always in my system.
It's always in your system. Got it. Which is how I was able to get him here today for this tasting. I think if you can't tell by his face, he's way more excited than he is for all other tastings because he loves champagne. But what are we doing with champagne today? We've got 3 bottles in front of us. You always have some objective of the educational aspect here. I'm really just here to enjoy. But what are you going to teach us today?
Well, champagne is something that most of us have enjoyed at some point in our lives. It is a delicious sparkling beverage, but there's a lot of mystery behind champagne because champagne is very often a blended wine, both in terms of being blended by different grape varieties, coming from different areas in Champagne, as well as maybe even blending different vintages together. And champagne is complicated because a lot of the most famous champagnes, think of Dom Perignon, think of Bollinger, think of Krug, Veuve Cliquot, all these houses have really excelled at creating a house style that is consistent from year to year because they're so good at blending. For the consumer, that is nice because you know what you're going to get. But for the wine geek, it's a little bit frustrating because it's hard to understand what is actually in each wine and which grapes are contributing what to the final blend. So there is another category of sparkling wine and champagne that we call grower producers. Grower producers specialize in making wine only from grapes they grow themselves. So they are, by definition, pretty small. Usually they only make wine from a handful of villages that are right around their own winery. So they really give us a little more insight into what each terroir and each grape actually gives to the wine.
They're called récoltants.
Yeah.
And then the big houses that you mentioned, like Moet Chandon and Veuve Cliquot, they're negociants, right? So they negotiate, they purchase a lot of fruit.
Exactly.
And the growers actually farm all the fruit that they make their wines from. So
exactly.
That's why they're in one area, typically a little more specifically.
Yep.
Right. And so with champagne, you alluded to, the blending. Champagne as a process is a bit complex, to say the least. So, we were talking about a wine with bubbles. We're talking about dosage and things like that. So do you want to walk us through, the process of champagne making to show maybe why champagne costs what it does and tastes like the way it does and why it is,
So it's important to understand first and foremost that champagne is wine before it is sparkling wine. There are 2 different fermentations that take place in champagne. And the first is an alcoholic fermentation that is the same as any other wine you've had before. White, red, rosé, they're all the same base fermentation. So in champagne, once you've got that first fermentation completed, that's what we call the base wine. And once you have a base wine, you can blend. You can blend using different grapes like we talked about, or different areas in champagne, or even using reserve wine from different vintages. So that is what we call assemblage.
Assemblage.
Very French term for blending.
Assemble, I believe, is the layman's term.
Yep. And once you have that blend all put together, that's time to start the second fermentation. So the second fermentation is something that the winemaker will choose to start by adding liqueur de tirage, which is a sugar solution that gets the yeast going again in the wine and really starts that second fermentation.
Yeah. So if you guys don't know fermentation, some people might not, we get alcohol by yeast eating sugar, and the byproduct is alcohol and CO2. And so when you trap the CO2, which is, I guess, what's happening in the second fermentation, right? In the bottle, you get this, you retain the carbonation.
Exactly. So in the first fermentation, the CO2 is just released into the atmosphere. And in the second fermentation, it is trapped, and that's what becomes the bubbles. So there are 2 very common styles of sparkling wine production for the second fermentation. The most used in Italy is called Charmat. That's what makes Prosecco. That's where they take a big tank of wine and do the second fermentation in there, and then bottle the wine under pressure. That creates kind of an industrialized process that makes very tasty wines, but they're a little more simple, both in terms of flavor and texture. the bubbles tend to be a little bit less fine. They're a little bit more frothy, which is why Prosecco is a little more affordable.
Yeah.
In Champagne, the bubbles are much finer. They're much smaller, and they create this really beautiful kind of creamy texture in the mouth that Roby likes to call the mousse.
The mousse. Yeah, it's a very fine mousse. A lot of people judge their favorite champagnes based on that mousse. But it is definitely a consistent, small, finer bubble when you talk about champagne. And I found actually that some people prefer a bubble of Prosecco, and that's totally fine too. Some people really like that poppy, big effervescence, and it's definitely better for cocktails and mixing and things like that, which is, people say don't make a cocktail with champagne. It's like, well, if you want to use champagne, nothing's too good. Maybe you want a finer bubble, but Prosecco, because it has those big bubbles, tends to do better in a French 75, even though Prosecco is not French.
So going back to the second fermentation, in the champagne method, it happens in every individual bottle. And that's why the bubbles are so small, because there's very little space for them to move around. And they just get really tight and really fine. So champagne is a much more labor-intensive process, even if they've mechanized it a little bit in recent years. Still a much more hands-on process that helps to justify the price of champagne.
Oh, yeah, definitely hands-on. We haven't even talked about riddling yet.
No, so once that second fermentation is complete, the wine ages in the cellar for a while, usually a few years at least, sometimes even up to 10 years or so. And during this process, the dead yeast cells fall out of suspension and to the bottom of the bottle. And once the winery feels that the wine is almost ready to release, they will take a bottle in the cellar and they will kind of put it
in a cellar.
Kind of a cellar. They'll put it neck facing down, about a 45-degree angle, and they will every day twist the bottle just a little bit and do that for a number of months.
You're not twisting it.
You just twisted it. So every day they'll do that for a few months, and that will help the lees to move down towards the neck of the bottle. And once all the lees are in the neck and the rest of the wine looks really clear, they will freeze the neck, and they'll pop out that little pellet, and all the lees will be gone. The rest of the wine will be clear, and after that they can decide if they want to add dosage or not.
True. Dosage. Another mixture of sugar solution, right?
Yep. So historically, Champagne was really, really cold. It's up in the north of France, and back in the day, Champagne was really, really acidic. So they used to add a lot of sugar just to make it drinkable. These days, with climate change and more advancements in growing grapes and ripeness, they're able to add much less sugar than they ever have. Some producers don't add any sugar at all. And there are many different levels. Exactly. So Roby can talk a little bit about the different levels of added sugar.
Oh yeah, we have so Brut Nature, obviously no added sugar, and then you have extra Brut. These champagnes are all between 6 to 8 grams a liter, Brut style. Pardon me, which is right on that line of extra Brut and Brut. Brut is a wider range of about 6 to 12, which is 6 to 12 grams of per liter of sugar added, and really anything less than 8 or around 8 and lower we consider to be a dry champagne. I mean, it feels dry. You don't really taste the sweetness. Maybe you do, being a little more dialed in on the palate, but tell me if that's
it's definitely subjective, but I find that most people start to taste the sugar at 9 or higher. Anything below 9 generally is going to taste pretty dry.
And that's all. I mean, 6 to 12 grams is what we're talking about here, and that's all in the Brut range. And so while Brut does translate to dry, we find we like our style a little on the lower end of the Brut range, and the Brut range can run to be a little more richer, rounder, have a little more actual sweetness to them. And preference is preference, but in an effort to show grapes themselves, we definitely wanted to show champagnes with a very, very similar dosage range.
And before you get worried that any of these wines taste sweet just because there's sugar added, that's really not the point of dosage at all. I like to think of dosage as adding seasoning or salt to a dish. Instead of actually tasting salty or sweet in this case, the dosage just brings out more flavor in the wine. It really just enhances everything. It makes the flavors pop. Mm-hmm. So at this level, you're not adding sweetness. You're just adding flavor.
Mm-hmm. Or enhancing the flavor. Yeah. I will counter that by saying I have my own. You use salt. I kind of say it can be used like makeup in a way, and I mean that in kind of a bad way. Not everyone uses it to do this, but a lot of champagnes you can mask the quality of the grapes by adding a certain amount of sugar to them. So you can have a more consistent flavor, and those that may enjoy a higher dosage are going to find a little more consistency in that higher dosage range. So you can use dosage in a high way to kind of cover up lesser fruit qualities or grapes that maybe don't quite deserve to be in a bottle of champagne in some producers' eyes. So anyway, I think mostly it is used as salt, but it can definitely cover some blemishes. And you'll notice some champagnes will consistently have a very, very high dosage. And I think part of that is because they make so much, and to make it more consistent flavor, you are actually adding the flavor that you were saying. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Should we talk? We didn't, well, there's also a little bit of age restrictions as well, compared to Prosecco, which, this must, to be a champagne, it must be aged for 4 years from the time it was picked or harvested to when it comes to sale. It must be aged on the lees for a certain amount of time as well as when the producer says when a wine is ready. But we should also talk about where we are in the world of wine, right? To have champagne on your label, I think it's very important to talk about where those grapes come from, right?
Yeah, so champagne has kind of become a synonym for sparkling wine, but that is not technically true. Champagne is a geographic area in the north of France, and to be called champagne in everywhere but the U.S., because we don't pay attention to rules like that, champagne has to come from this particular region. It has to be grown in one little area, actually a pretty big area, and there are three main zones that we're going to focus on today.
Yeah, so this is obviously a map of France for those of you who haven't seen this before. On the top right here, the Champagne in the region here, Petit a little bit right here about, and you're talking now about this red box.
Yeah, so most people think of Reims as the biggest city in Champagne, because it is, and a lot of the big houses are based there. Mm-hmm. It's up in the north. It's can you point to it there, Robbie?
So we all know where it is. I got the Reims right here.
There we go. So that's Reims, and just south of Reims is what they call the Montagne de Reims. It's an area that kind of faces north and east, and that is best known for Pinot Noir. It tends to make richer, more powerful wines. As you see, that kind of turns around to the west. That comes right up next to Epernay, which is the second biggest town in Champagne. And that is kind of the geographic center of these three areas. Mm-hmm. Moving to the west of Epernay, we have the Val de la Marne. Marne is a famous river, and the area of the Val de la Marne is primarily Pinot Meunier. And as you move south from Epernay itself, you get the Côte de Blanc, which is known for its chalk and limestone soils, and that is predominantly Chardonnay that you'll find in the wines made from there.
Yeah, and why are they growing Pinot Noir? I mean, usually I would think Pinot Noir would take to a warmer climate, so it would be further south. So why is Pinot up in the north and Chardonnay is in the south, and then all of a sudden in the middle you're going to do Pinot Meunier?
So it has to do a lot with soil, and this is a big generalization, but in the north there's a little bit more clay and limestone that Pinot Noir really likes a lot. In the Valley de la Marne, there's a lot more sand, and Meunier tends to really excel in sandy soils. And down in the south, in the Côte de Blanc, it is primarily chalk with some limestone as well. And Chardonnay really expresses that minerality really nicely.
Nice. And so the Chardonnay you're talking from the Côte de Blanc here, I believe the Pierre Gimonnet, right from the village of Cuis, right in the...
just at the north of the Côte de Blanc. It's kind of north-facing vineyards, Premier Cru for that reason. And it really makes a beautifully balanced, really classic style of Blanc de Blanc.
Right, Blanc de Blanc. And then Gaston Chiquet is in the village of Dizy here. You'll see on the western side.
Yeah, just to the north of the Marne River, but towards the west of the Grand Valais, which is what we like to kind of break out of the Vallée de la Marne.
Well, so the Grand Valais is kind of this center part right here, correct?
Exactly. Right. Just north of Epernay, a little bit to the east, a little bit to the west. It's an area that is less sand in the soil. There's a little bit towards the western side, so there's some more Pinot Meunier there. But as you move to the east, it really has more similarity to what you'd find in the Montagne de Reims.
Right. Which is why you see those Pinot houses in IE and things like that. And then Marc Hebrart, which is going to be our third producer today, is from very close to where Gaston Chiquet is, but more on the east side of the Grand Valais.
Yeah, just a few villages east in Mareuil-sur-Ailly.
Right. And mostly Pinot Noir, just because of that slight difference in changes, what grapes are going to be grown there. Well, all that talk has got me pretty thirsty. I did take a sip while you were talking. I'm surprised that you refrained from touching your glasses to this point. But we're going to start with the Pierre Gimonnet. So we're drinking out of the half bottles today. That's what the trio for $100 was sold at, 3 half bottles. So you can kind of taste these champagnes, get an idea of maybe your preferences versus one over the other. But if you do like something, you need something for the holidays, we're going to be selling these out of 750s. So the Pierre Gimonnet 750 ml bottle, Cuis bottling the exact same wine for $55. Pierre Gimonnet is the producer. They are a récoltant, and it is a Blanc de Blanc champagne, which means?
Usually it means Chardonnay. Blanc de Blanc just means white of whites. So it means that every grape that goes into it is white. Chardonnay is 99.9% of the white grapes in Champagne. They are allowed to grow some others, but they're really the exception to the rule. So usually when you see Blanc de Blanc, it's going to be 100% Chardonnay. Right.
And when you get a wine like Gimonnet that is 100% Chardonnay, is this Chardonnay? What is Blanc de Blanc champagne from the Côte de Blanc like, I guess, compared to maybe Chardonnay, what we think of in our minds for those who...
So a lot of people think about Chardonnay as being oaky and buttery, especially here in California, and this could not be farther from that. Chardonnay from the Côte de Blanc tends to be very, very dry, very mineral. There's very little fruit to it. If you've had Chablis before, you can kind of think of Chablis with bubbles. Just really crisp and refreshing, very, very clean, really bright, a little bit more of a kind of shellfish or oyster or kind of aperitif style of champagne.
Yeah, and so because it has a little less fruit than, say, a Pinot Meunier, I mean, is that why I feel more astringency on the palate? I mean, is it a higher acid varietal as well? I mean, why?
It's not necessarily higher acid, but to me, the lack of fruit makes the acid seem a little higher in our perception. The perceived acidity really jumps out at you as being a little stronger.
Yeah, I feel that. All right, right in the middle of my palate is where I kind of get, if people are trying to decipher what is minerality, it's a non-fruit. It's any non-fruit flavor, right? So in the Côte de Blanc, it'll usually express itself as a chalkiness, mineral. He mentioned Chablis, which is Kimmeridgian limestone soils that are the White Cliffs of Dover, same thing. And they just have this mineral component is chalky, stony. You'll hear whetstone in Chablis. I feel the minerality. Do you feel the minerality?
Yeah, it really gets your mouth watering.
Yeah. You feel the minerality, and like right in the middle of the palate, you can almost sense this chalkiness. And sometimes you've blinded me on wines that you can just. It's more about the soil than the grape.
Yeah, it's very distinctive.
And I still think about some of those. I'm always wrong, but those inaccuracies really stick out to me when I was wrong about those terroir differences. So with this, being Chardonnay, it compared to Pinot Noir, definitely a lighter varietal, being white versus a red grape. But are you enjoying this with food, or is this simply an aperitif for you? It feels pretty serious. I feel like I could enjoy it with some stuff.
Yeah, definitely. It has versatility. I mean, it's the lightest of the bunch, so it can be enjoyed on its own. It can be enjoyed with really light things, but it's not too light that it can't stand up to other dishes as well. It's a good go-to.
And if I'm looking at Blanc de Blancs, is it always kind of this lighter, crisper style?
So it depends. If you're seeing a non-vintage or multi-vintage Blanc de Blanc, it's generally going to be in a clean, crisp style like this. Blanc de Blanc can be a lot more rich and textural. Usually those are vintage Blanc de Blancs where they spend more years on the lees to develop that texture and richness. So those can be a little more powerful, a little bit more serious, a little bit less aperitif style, if you will. But always that minerality is the common thread through Blanc de Blanc.
Yeah, I personally love it, but I think sometimes we, as Somms, crave something that kind of pushes back our palate a little more. And so if this isn't someone's favorite, I wouldn't be surprised. Some people really look for this leaner, meaner style, this tasty style. But if this isn't your way, it might be just because of that perceived acidity. Sure. And maybe something like Gaston Chiquet would be more up the alley. I mean, put your nose in too, and it almost smells fruitier, right?
So Chiquet is in DZ, which is towards the west end of the Grand Valais, right before it opens up to the more sandy soils of the Valley de la Marne. And it's Pinot Meunier based, but there are also Pinot Noir and Chardonnay blended into this. But Meunier is the dominant varietal, and you smell it on the nose right away. It really just jumps out of the glass with fruit that was totally absent in the Blanc de Blanc.
Yeah. I mean, just going back, it's a, I don't want to use the word green, but it's lean. You can sense that
Yeah,
This has like a
Chiquet has a
fruit to
much
it.
rounder, rounder feel to it.
Mhm.
A lot
And
more
smell.
fruit.
And
Yeah,
smell to
the
it.
aromatics are a little bit floral, sometimes
Mhm.
from Meunier. Meunier is really, really fun. I think it's very crowd pleasing as well, especially in a blend like this. If you're not sure what you like or you're not sure what your guests like, this is the most crowd pleasing wine of the bunch. I would say it's always a safe bet to pour Chiquet.
Yeah. It's 45. Chiquet is 45% Meunier, which is a really high propensity of Meunier. And Meunier as a grape was not always respected, or I've kind of read some things that's kind of like this, like, you know, that's like the step sister of the grapes. You know, it's not as respected, or you don't talk about it, or what is that still the case, or is that passé? What's going
Meunier
on?
has always been kind of the third wheel in Champagne after Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. It's always been involved in blending for almost every house out there, but it's kind of looked down upon because it struggles to ripen in the same way that Chardonnay and Pinot Noir do. So back in the past, when things weren't as warm as they are today, Meunier could often display a little vegetal or green flavor. Global warming, climate change, whatever you want to call it, has certainly helped Meunier get more ripeness. And to the point that there are actually a lot of grower producers now that only grow Meunier, and they specialize in making a range of Meunier wines that are really fantastic. So Meunier is definitely having its day. It's kind of trendy these days, but for good reason. It's delicious.
Yeah, the fruit, the freshness, the lift, it's all there. If you need help finding some Meunier, we could definitely get some for you. Just reach out to us because, you know, while there are growers that are making these 100% Meunier wines, they're not really prevalent in a lot of markets or in a lot of stores. So it's definitely something that's sought as opposed to something you see every day. But yeah, I get all that freshness of fruit. Even if you go back and you taste the Chardonnay, it almost does a disservice to the Gimonnet just because it has so much fruit and freshness, liveliness, and a little more kind of roundness and softness of texture that kind of makes us feel a little too lean. Whereas in the beginning, it just tasted great.
See, that's subjectivity. I find it really crisp and refreshing coming off the Chiquet. But
that's true. That's a good point. That's a good point. That's a good point. All right, so we should go to Marc Hebrart now.
Sure. So Hebrart is in Mareuil-sur-Ailly, towards the eastern end of the Grand Valais. And this is an area that has little to no Pinot Meunier. It's primarily Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in this area.
It's way deeper on the nose, just right as you put your nose.
Yeah, it's concentrated. It's powerful. This wine selection is made from 4 different villages, including Mareuil, Ailly, Avenay, and Buzoy. They're all contiguous, right on the north bank of the Marne River. The vines are all over 40 years old, so really significant age for a non-vintage champagne. And this is always about 2/3 Pinot Noir and 1/3 Chardonnay.
Yeah, so no Pinot Meunier.
0.
Which is, Marc Hebrart doesn't have any Pinot Meunier, correct?
They've got none.
One of the few places. But when you talk about that depth, right in, it's just lower. Everything in the glass is kind of like weighty but full. Yeah, and it's really beautiful.
Yeah, Pinot Noir from this area is all about texture and concentration. It's really got a lot of depth, a lot of power, really intense flavors. Yeah. This is the most vinous of the wines. I mean, I would not use this as an aperitif or you know, kind of cocktail hour kind of champagne. It really justifies serving it with something a little more hearty. If you're roasting a whole chicken or even having veal as a main course, this is something that can stand up to meatier dishes like that really easily.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a saying, you know, when in doubt, drink champagne.
Absolutely.
Why do we gravitate towards that, other than the fact that it's just delicious?
Champagne really is very, very good with a wide range of things, and it's really hard to find a dish that champagne tastes bad with. It might not be the best pairing, but champagne is rarely going to taste bad with anything.
Right.
It's going to be a nice, delicious thing to drink throughout any kind of meal, any kind of occasion. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, I like to say.
Yeah, I think Marc Hebrart shows that in the sense that, you know, it feels refreshing because it's champagne and it has bubbles and has crispness. But if you really were to leave this out for 2 hours and then drink it as a wine, you're drinking almost like a still Pinot Noir, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you have concentration, you have texture from the lees aging, right? You have this richness, and not to say that Chiquet also doesn't have that, or that Gimonnet doesn't also have that as champagne, but by far this is the richest one, and therefore it's going to go with you know, some richer foods than say Gimonnet, and therefore run the gamut of a menu per se, than maybe another champagne.
Sure.
Yeah, Chiquet as well, because of its Pinot Meunier profile. Well, I'm surprised that I drink so much more Gimonnet than the Hebrart, but all three delicious. Always a pleasure to get on camera with you. Even more of a pleasure to be able to drink champagne with you, as you've been a huge mentor in my development in champagne. And I hope that we share many glasses together.
Pleasure is mine.
Cheers. Thank you all.